Hey y'all, Calvin here. If you are watching this, it should be week 2 of class, and you should have just discussed two-way tables just yesterday or today, depending on when you're watching this. And in this video, we're going to look at how you can actually go about constructing your own two-way tables using real data. So let's dive right in. Okay. So we mentioned on Monday that two-way tables help us look at the relationship between two variables. For instance, if I had two variables, if I had variable person is Mormon and person lives in Utah, a two-way table or its corresponding pie chart could help me make a comparison between those groups, see how they're related to each other. For instance, I could take the pie of all Mormons, let's say in the US, right? And I could carve out a slice on that pie representing the percent of them that live in Utah. Would probably be a pretty sizable chunk. We could also use two-way tables or their corresponding pie charts to compare different groups, right? So for instance, if I have the group of Wellesley alumni and the group of Smith alumni, right, I could look at the Wellesley pie chart, right, of Wellesley alums, and then see how big is the slice of them, what percent of them go on to graduate school when they graduate. And then I could look at the same slice, the slice of folks who go to graduate school within the Smith pie, right? And then I could compare those two slices, see which one is bigger within its respective pie. Right? So these two-way tables let us examine the relationship between variables. And last time we talked about some tricks for how to read them, just to kind of briefly touch on that again. Right? In this table, this is on the column here, we're looking at different variables such as the education of a husband, education of wife. These are looking at basically things about members of a heterosexual marriage. Okay? And then on the columns, we have some other thing, mostly other variables, mostly regarding the children of that couple. Okay? So the big thing we talked about was how, if I look at, say, this 37.5, what does that mean? Right? There's kind of two candidates. Right? One thing that we might be tempted to say is that of all the people with all the husbands with a bachelor's degree or higher, right, 37.5% of them are in opposite sex marriages? Or is it that all in the pie of all opposite sex marriage couples, right, 37.5% of them have a husband that has a bachelor's degree or higher. Right? And we talked about the way to figure out which of those is correct, because only one of those is actually correct. Right? We have to see, okay, what is the pie that we're dealing with? And to determine that, we have to look at, am I dealing with rows or column percentages? Right? If I try to add up the rows here, right, if bachelor's degree or higher represented our pie, right, that would mean that these were our slices: a 37.5% slice, a 35.3% slice, 40.9%, right? And these would need to add up to 100, but they don't, right? It's too much. So this can't be our pie. Instead, we notice that 1, 2, 3, 4, this little subsection of this column adds up to 100. Okay, so the correct interpretation of this 37.5, is that out of all opposite sex married couples, right, 37.5% of them feature a husband with a bachelor's degree or higher. Okay, so just a quick refresh, and we see that these add to 100, these add to 100, these add to 100 as well. Okay. So we kind of just handed you this data yesterday, right? But you might want to construct your own, right? Rather than just being handed whatever information the person you are, the writer that wrote the piece you're reading on, wants you to see. Right? You might find this data in Gallup polls and journal articles, but if you wanted to construct your own, right, you would want to go to something like the General Social Survey, which is a really cool resource that we're going to be dealing with today. Right? What this is basically going to be a repository for survey data that was collected on Americans between 1972 and 2018. Right? And it examines a really wide range of variables from do you think parents today are doing a better job than their parents did at parenting? What qualities do you look for in a friend? What should be the highest priority for the US? Do you like jazz? Right? All kinds of questions that were asked. And what's cool is that these were asked from all the way from 1972 to 2018. There have been some questions were added or omitted over the years, but you can kind of see how things have progressed over time. And you have a very large collection of data. Right? And what's cool is you can actually use these to construct your own two-way tables. Okay? So that's what we're going to be doing. So follow along with me here. Right? And go to sda.berkeley.edu. Okay. All right, you're going to have an assignment that is due this week that has to do with this table creation. But first, I just want to step through how we actually create one. Okay, so you're going to go to this Berkeley website, going to click on the SDA archive link here. Okay. Then scroll, right? And you're going to go to the General Social Science, the GSS cumulative data file right here. Okay. Click that, and that should take you to a page that looks like this. What you're going to do is you're going to input the row variable you want and the column variable you want. And it's going to create whatever two-way table is generated by that pair. Okay, so let's actually look at the list of variables we could choose from because there's a lot of them. Right? So click on the standard codebook link. I'd actually open it in a new tab. Okay. And then click on sequential variable list. And listed on here are a whole bunch of not even variables, but actually subcategories of variables, right? So if I click on, for instance, religious attendance and identity here, that gets me, that's all of these different variables, right? So one variable is, did you attend religious service last Sunday, right? Or see, if you're Catholic, what's your identity, right? I guess there's different subcategories here. Right? There are different kinds of variables, right? And so let's just pick one of them, right? So let's do the first one. So @relig is just, they're gonna ask each respondent in the survey, last week, did you attend a religious survey, right? Religious service, right? So let's actually click on the link here, right? And that's going to take you to the full question that was asked to those respondents, right? They were actually asked, now I'm going to ask you about things you did during the last 7 days. I'm only interested in what you did during the last 7 days. From the last, whatever was a week ago to today, did you attend religious services, right? And they could respond yes or no, okay? So this is a variable, right? Let's actually take this, copy it, and then go back to this page, right? And let's stick it in the row variable here, right, for @relig. Okay. We need one more variable, right? Because we're trying to look at the relationship between whether people went to church within the last week or some kind of religious gathering in the last week. Let's maybe go back to, let's see, let's go to voting patterns, right, under personal family information. And let's just go with the first one here, which is political party affiliation. Click that. And I'm going to highlight our variable here. This variable is, they're asked, generally speaking, do you usually think of yourself as a Republican, Democrat, Independent, or what? Right? And they kind of have a little spectrum here from very strong Democrat to very strong Republican, and they also have the option for other party, right? So they can give any of these responses. So I'm going to input that here. Right? And then we're almost ready to generate the two-way table, right? But there's a few more options we need to check here. Right? So let's go to output options. You're going to keep it on percentaging column. That means we're going to be making column tables, right? Using column percentages, meaning the column should add up to 100%. Right? You're going to switch that to row later in your assignment. So this is where you would do that. Okay. Go down and unclick color coding. That ends up just making things kind of confusing. So we're going to unclick it, and then click on question text, because that actually displays the what the actual questions were, right, which is helpful to remember. And then one more thing, go to chart options, and we've been working with pie charts, so we would like some pie charts to be displayed. Go to type of chart, and go to the drop down to pie chart. Okay, and that's it. So let's go to run the table, and it should generate something like this, right? A two-way table and a series of pie charts, okay? The only numbers you need to really pay attention to here are the bold ones. Those are going to be the percentages, right? Since this is a column two-way table, we should see that the column percentages are adding up to 100, and indeed we do see that, right? 41 plus 59 equals 100. So if we were going to try to interpret this 41, we would say something like, out of all people who consider themselves strong Democrats, right? This is our pie, right? Out of all people who consider themselves strong Democrats, 41% of them said, yes, I went to church within, or some religious service within the last week. Okay? So that's how we would interpret one of these. You can also kind of look at the pie charts, and the pie charts in particular can help you tell a short story about what you are observing here. For each of these pie charts, each one represents a different level on the political ideology spectrum, right? From strong Democrat all the way up to strong Republican, and of course, other party. And the green slice here represents what percent of that group went to a religious service within the last week, right? So for here are the three Democrat groups, right? Looks like between like a quarter to maybe 2/3 of them went to church within the last week, depending on which group of these they were in, right? But if we look at the Republicans, they overall, this is near Republican, moderate Republican, strong Republican, right? They seem to have a larger chunk of the pie going towards, yes, I attended religious service within the last week, right? So the general kind of trend here seems to be that Republicans are more likely to have gone to a religious service within the last week than someone who identifies as a Democrat did. Okay, so those are the two kind of skills we want you to be comfortable with. Aside from being able to generate these tables, we want you to be able to look at just a particular one of these numbers and write a full sentence, just explaining what that means, right? And also be able to look at the table and kind of tell a story, right? Social scientists and other scientists are really just storytellers, right? So it's helpful to be able to look at this and make a simple, sweet kind of summary of what's happening here. Okay, so let me go back to these slides for a second. Here is what your task is going to be. Right? You're going to work with a partner on this assignment. They'll be assigned on whatever day we end up doing this lab on, which will be during a virtual session. Right? When you get your partner, when you are introduced to them, you should create a Google Doc between the two of you so that you can both edit this, right, even when you're not together, right, or not speaking to each other on Zoom. Right? That's going to be what you submit when you're done. Right? Just submitting that single Google Doc will suffice for both of you. Make sure both your names on it. Okay? And make sure you exchange your email address before you leave the breakout group. Okay? The instructions for this lab are going to be posted under GSS Lab on our course website, right? Calling it anything that we work on that is basically kind of working on something related to some particular like concrete skill, especially with computer. Sometimes I'm just going to call it a lab. So this is the GSS Lab. Okay. So here's what I'd like you to do before you come to class on whatever Zoom day we end up doing this. I want you to look through the code book, right, and find 4 different variables that interest you. So just a reminder, the code book, right, is this big long list right here, right? I want you to click on one of these, right, and look through and find a variable that interests you, right? Remember that these little brief descriptions are just that. They are brief descriptions. Right? So you'll want to actually click on this and actually see what was the question that they were actually asking here. Okay? Find 4 that interest you. Right? And once you've done that, I want you to go over to the survey corresponding to this video, right, and record those 4 variables, as well as the question text for each individual survey. Right? So remember, the question text is going to be this bit right here. Okay, you can list the responses too. That would be lovely. Okay. And that's all you have to do before class, right? When you get to class, you'll have your 4 variables. Your partner will have their 4 variables. You will meet your partner then, right? And then you're going to also input your variables on the Google Doc that you create together. Okay. Okay, starting in virtual class on Tuesday, you're going to create a two-way table and the corresponding pie charts, similar to what we just did for the @relig and poll views variables. The two variables you use should come from your list of 8, right? So if you picked 4, and your partner picked 4, pick any 2 of those 8, right? Make a two-way table with them. Maybe pick a couple that you think would have an interesting relationship. Then examine your table, right? Pick a particular percent in your two-way table, right? What pie is that out of? Try to verbalize a sentence interpreting what that percent means. Okay? Let's do an example of this, right? So we did the one with the religious services and political views, right? Let me make a new survey. Let's go back, right? So let me change this to FE Perez and ABANY. This is the variable, would you vote for a female president, right? And this is, should women be able to get an abortion for any reason? Okay, so let's run the table on this. Okay, on here, you'll get a bit of a smaller table. This 7.7, what does that mean? What I want you to do is on the survey corresponding to this video, write down what does that 7.7 mean, right? One sentence, tell me what it means. Okay, that's what you're going to do on the lab for the tables that you actually make. You'll do that as well. This is just a practice for that. Then go back, flip the row and columns. Try doing that, right? And then interpret that. Right? Decide whether it's easier to have your table as row percentages or column percentages when you keep the variables locked in place. Okay? Sometimes one way can be easier than the other. For instance, if you have variables sleeps for 7 hours and sex, right? Then you're going to me, hearing 60% of women sleep 7 hours or more, for some reason that's easier for me to think about than 55% of people who sleep 7 hours or more are women. I don't know. For some reason, this one is just easier for me to compute, right? So pick a direction. Then, last step on that table is write 2 sentences describing a pattern you see in the two-way table or pie charts that you've inserted into your Google Doc, right? So for the one we just did with the religious services and political affiliation, right? You might say the more politically conservative people are, the more likely they are to have attended religious services in the last week. Even among conservatives, only about half attended services in the last week. Nationally, about a third of people have. Something like that, right? Let's do another practice on this, right? If we go over to the two-way table we just made, again, looking at the variables of would you vote for a woman president and should women be able to have an abortion for any reason, right? Looking at the pie charts and looking at the two-way table, what kind of story can be told here, right? Maybe comparing the women who, the people who said no, right? And how many of them said that they would vote no for a woman president versus for people who said yes, anyone who wants an abortion should be able to have one for any reason, right? And whether they said, no, I would not vote for a woman president, right? On the survey associated with this video, write down a couple of sentences about what you observe here. Okie doke. And then you're going to do that a total of 4 times. 4 times using your 8 variables, you're going to create a two-way table and then write down a couple of sentences describing the trend that you see there. Okay. And then your last task is, I want us to be able to share what we did in class. So once you have created your 4 tables and you've done everything else, writing the 2 sentences for each of them, I want you and your partner to each pick one of the two-way tables that you've created together. Then there's going to be a kind of class slideshow that I'm going to create where you can go in and add basically a slide which describes your two-way table that you found. On that slide, you should put an image of your table, a brief description of your 2 variables, and a 1-sentence summary. Also your name and not your partner's name, because this is yours. When we, on the class after we work on this, we're going to go through and everyone will just kind of briefly describe what they found in their table. Okay. This is a little demo one for the one we just did, right? Basically talking, here are the two variables, right? Here's your two-way table, and here's what's kind of just a one-sentence tendency that we found, right? I may also ask you, what does this 22 mean here? Give me a sense for what that means. So make sure you understand what's going on in your two-way table and ask for help if you don't. Okay, last thing, just a few things to look out for while you're creating these. If you see the letter R on any of your variables, that stands for respondent. Okay, so for instance, right, R's family income when 16 years old, right? That's respondent's family income, right? The person being asked the question. At some point, you might get an error which says no valid cases, right? So let me give you an example of that. If I use the variables grnex, agg, this is, I looked these up beforehand, and milokme, right? This is the variable for our concerns about environmentalism, over-exaggerated, and is the military a good experience for men, right? If I were to try to make a two-way table with this, I would get no valid cases. What that means is that since the questions for the GSS are kind of shuffled around and aren't offered, the same ones aren't offered every year necessarily, this means that these two questions were never asked in the same year. So we actually don't have any people who answered both of them, and we can't make a two-way table, right? So if that happens, just pick new variables, right? You are, by the way, you are not married to your list of 8 variables that you write down. You can change those when you are trying to construct these two-way tables. Avoid variables involving income. The main reason for that, even though this is an interesting variable, is because the GSS data spans so many years, there's the problem of inflation. It's difficult to compare income right now to income in the 1970s and 80s. Right? So avoid anything involving income. And the last thing is avoid variables with too many categories, right, that have many answers to this, possible answers to the survey question, right? So for example, if you use education, which represents the number of years of education someone has, right, that can range from 0 to 25. That's no good. That's going to give you a bonkers pie chart. Same thing with age. Let me show you. So if I go to age, and then let's say smoke, this is the variable, do you smoke, yes or no? And I make a pie chart, or sorry, a two-way table. It's going to be a really big two-way table, right? That's really hard to read and interpret, right? We have smoking, yes or no up here. That's a fine variable, but age is so many variables, or so many different categories, right? That's not going to work. And your pie chart is going to look like something out of Wheel of Fortune. It's going to be really hard to read, right? So just avoid variables with too many categories. Okay. Thanks for hanging in. I know that was a bit of a longer video than usual, but I will see you soon for the construction of these two-way tables. Bye.